The thermometer on the cabin wall read 41 degrees Fahrenheit, and Eleanor Marsh had checked it 3 times since midnight, pressing her thumb against the brass housing as though the warmth of her skin might coax the mercury upward by sheer insistence. It had not moved. 3 in the morning, November 15th, 1887, and the darkness outside pressed against the small windows. Not like weather, but like something with intention. Something that had chosen tonight to test the seams of the world Eleanor had built around her children. She rose from the chair slowly, her hips stiff from sitting without moving, and crossed the 12 feet of plank floor to the northwest corner, where Clara and Henry slept beneath 2 quilts and a wool blanket that had been her mother's before it was hers. The fire in the iron stove burned steadily behind her, feeding on split oak she had loaded twice since 10 o'clock, and still the cold came through the floor as though the boards were made of gauze. She could feel it through the soles of her wool socks, a chill that moved upward through her ankles and into her knees, and settled there like something permanent. Clara lay curled on her side, dark hair fanned across the pillow, 8 years old, and already carrying the quietness of someone who had learned that certain things could not be asked about. Eleanor touched her daughter's forehead with the back of 2 fingers. Cold to the touch, but not the kind of cold that stopped the blood. Not yet. Henry was the one she was watching. 5 years old, his face pale even in the amber light of the banked fire, his lips carrying the faint bluish tint that had begun appearing 3 weeks ago and had not entirely left since. Eleanor lowered herself to her knees beside the bed and brought her ear to within 2 inches of her son's mouth. There it was, the sound she had been listening for and dreading simultaneously, the shallow and slightly wet pull of air into lungs that were fighting the cold from the inside, raspy at the edges. Not alarming, not yet, but carrying a note that made her chest tighten the way a rope tightens when weight is added slowly, and you cannot be sure how much more it will hold. She stayed there for longer than she needed to, listening, because listening was the only thing she could do that felt like control. When she returned to her chair, she opened the small notebook she kept on the side table, the one she had begun filling in early November when the night started dropping, and she needed something to do with her hands besides wring them. Inside, recorded in her careful upright script, was a column of numbers, dates on the left, outdoor temperatures on the right, indoor temperatures beside them. The pattern was clear enough that she did not need to study it long. October had been cold. November was something else. The warmest the cabin had been indoors since the 4th was 52 degrees, and that had been on an afternoon when the sun stayed out long enough to heat the south wall for 3 hours. The coldest indoor temperature she had recorded was 39 2 nights ago, with the fire burning the entire time. She turned to a fresh page and wrote November 15th. Below it, 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 o'clock a.m. Fire burning. Then she sat looking at what she had written as if the act of recording it might change what it meant. It did not. The coat hanging on the hook beside the door belonged to Daniel. It had been his work coat, heavy canvas lined with wool, worn through at both elbows, and smelling faintly of pine sap and the coal smoke smell of a man who spent his days outdoors in the high Montana air. Eleanor had not moved it since April. She wore it every night when she went outside to check the woodpile or the water bucket or the sky, not because it was the warmest garment in the cabin, but because putting it on felt like a conversation she was not ready to stop having. Some nights she wore it for an hour after she came back inside, sitting by the fire with the collar turned up and her hands in the pockets where she could still find the shape of where his hands had been. She was not a woman given to sentiment as a general practice. Her father had not raised her that way. But grief she had learned in the 7 months since the wagon had come back from the Western Ridge, carrying what remained of her husband, was not something you argued yourself out of. It was something you wore until it changed shape, and then you wore the new shape for a while, and eventually the wearing itself became a kind of forward motion. What she could not afford, not with 2 children and a woodpile that was diminishing faster than she had planned, and a winter that showed no sign of feeling sorry about any of it, was to let forward motion stop. She rose and put the coat on and stepped outside. The cold struck her face like a thrown object. Her breath turned to fog before she had taken 3 steps, and the stars overhead burned with a clarity that came only when every particle of moisture had been driven out of the air by temperatures that did not negotiate. She walked to the woodpile along the south wall of the cabin and ran her hands along the split logs, checking their dryness by touch the way her father had taught her to assess the quality of anything, not by looking at it, but by touching it with the attention it deserved. The wood was good. Daniel had cut it right, let it season properly, stacked it with the cut ends facing out the way it needed to be stacked. What he had not done through no fault of his own was cut enough of it. Eleanor stood in the November dark doing the arithmetic she had been doing every night for 2 weeks, the kind of arithmetic that never comes out the way you need it to. At the rate she was burning, she had enough wood to reach the middle of January if the winter held at its current severity. The winter was already worse than current, and it was only November. If she reduced the fire to conserve wood, the temperature inside the cabin would drop to levels that Henry's lungs could not handle. If she burned at the rate the cold required, she would run out of fuel 6 weeks before the last frost. She was a good mathematician. That was the problem. When she went back inside, Henry had started coughing. She reached him before the third cough and got him sitting upright, her hand flat against his back, feeling the deep, wet shudder of it. The cough ran through him like something trying to get out, shaking his small frame until it subsided into a string of shorter rasps and then quiet. She gave him water from the clay jug she kept near the stove, and he drank with his eyes still mostly closed, trusting her without needing to think about it, the way children trust before the world teaches them that trust requires evidence. Clara had woken beside him. Her eyes found Eleanor's in the dim light we'd and old for 8. Is Henry going to be all right? The words came out barely above a whisper. Eleanor took her daughter's hand and rubbed it between her own because it was too cold. He'll be fine. Go back to sleep. She said it with the full weight of her voice, not because she was certain it was true, but because certainty was what the moment required of her. And she had learned a long time ago that sometimes what a person needed to offer was not what they happened to be feeling. Clara lay back down. Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed until both children's breathing had settled into sleep again, and then she sat there a while longer in the dark because leaving felt like abandonment, and she could not afford that feeling tonight, on top of all the other feelings. The day Ruth Calloway came by with a basket of preserved apples, Eleanor was outside splitting kindling in the thin gray light of a mid-November afternoon, working through the motions with a focus that had less to do with the task than with the need to keep her body occupied while her mind worked through things it had not yet solved. Ruth came down the path from the east wrapped in a brown wool shawl, her breath fogging in front of her, carrying the basket over one arm, and the particular expression she always carried, which was warm at its center and worried at its edges. They went inside and Ruth set the basket on the table and looked around the cabin with the attentive, cataloging gaze of a woman who paid attention to the details of other people's lives because she had 3 children of her own and understood survival as a practice that required information. Her eyes moved to the windows where frost had formed on the inside of the glass. They moved to the children who were seated near the stove wrapped in blankets and working through the letters of the alphabet on a scrap of paper. They moved back to Eleanor. You're burning a lot of wood. Ruth said it without judgment, just as a fact she wanted Eleanor to have the chance to address. The cold's been hard. Eleanor poured water from the kettle into 2 tin cups and handed one over. Ruth wrapped both hands around her cup. Some families are talking about digging root cellars. For the food storage mostly, but it keeps the children occupied, and Thomas Wright says the earthen walls hold the temperature better than above ground. She paused, looking at Eleanor over the rim of her cup. Have you thought about it? Eleanor said, perhaps which was not a lie and was not the truth. What she had been thinking about lately was different from a root cellar, but she did not know yet if it was different in the way that mattered, which was the way of things that actually worked, rather than things that merely seemed reasonable at 3 in the morning when the alternatives were running out. Ruth stayed another quarter hour talking about the other families in the settlement and the way the winter was hitting everyone and the worry she had about old Mrs. Peyton living alone on the east side of the creek. When she left, Eleanor stood at the window and watched her move back along the path, and she felt the complicated feeling she always felt when Ruth visited, which was gratitude and wariness in equal measure. Ruth meant well. Ruth was also constitutionally incapable of holding information inside herself when other people were around to share it with. It was not a flaw exactly. It was simply what Ruth was. And it meant that anything Eleanor told her would belong to the settlement within 48 hours. There were things Eleanor was not ready for the settlement to know. She knew Samuel Holt by sight and reputation before she knew him by anything else. He was the man who had built most of the structures in Bitterroot Creek, including the cabin she was standing in, and he had the quiet, self-contained quality of someone who had learned to read the physical world at a depth most people never needed to reach. She saw him sometimes through the window, never asking, never announcing himself, just appearing at a neighbor's fence or roofline and beginning work that clearly needed doing and then disappearing again when it was done. He had sandy gray hair and strong hands, and he moved through the settlement like a man who belonged to the work rather than to the place. The morning after Ruth's visit, he was at the Hendersons' place, 2 lots to the east up on the roof in 20-degree weather, reseating a chimney cap that had worked loose in the last wind. He worked without hurry and without company, methodical and unhurried, the same way Eleanor's father had worked in the mine, and she stood at her window longer than she meant to watching him because there was something in the watching that reminded her of something she could not quite name. Thanksgiving morning, Reverend James Alcott walked from the church at the north end of the settlement to Eleanor's door and stood on the step with his hat in both hands, tall and lean and formal in the way of a man who took his responsibilities seriously and was never quite sure which responsibilities those were. Eleanor invited him inside. Claire and Henry were at the table with scraps of charcoal and paper drawing the things children draw when the world outside is too cold to invite them. Alcott sat in the chair Eleanor indicated and accepted coffee and looked around the room with the thoroughness of a man conducting an assessment while pretending to be making a social call. He asked after the children. He noted with a gentleness that was also a kind of pressure that Eleanor had been managing alone for 7 months now, and that there was no shame in finding the arrangement difficult. "We're doing well enough." The words came out level because she had shaped them carefully enough by then that they no longer sounded rehearsed. Alcott studied her the way he studied everything with the patient, penetrating attention of a man who believed that the truth about a person's condition was available to anyone willing to look carefully enough. "I would ask you to come to me or to the church if there is anything needed." He paused. "The community takes care of its own." Eleanor thanked him. He rose to go and then paused at the door, pulling his hat back on, and in the particular casual tone that men used when they had saved the most important thing for last. "I had word from the land office in Helena. They'll be sending someone out after winter to assess how the settlements came through. A man named Kimball, a government surveyor. They want to know what the conditions were like, what worked, and what didn't." He said it the way a person says something they believe is minor information, and Eleanor filed it away with the instinct of someone who had learned that minor information was often the most important kind. She stood at the window after he left and watched him walk north in the pale Thanksgiving light, and she thought about what he had said about what worked and what didn't, and she looked down at the floor beneath her feet, and she thought about her father. His name had been Robert. He had worked silver mines in Colorado for 20 years, first near Leadville and then north of it, and he had the hands and the lungs that mining gave a man, and the working knowledge of the earth that came from spending your days inside it. He had died when Eleanor was 16 in a collapse at a shaft near Butte that took him and 2 other men in the time it took to breathe. But before he died, he had told her things about the ground that she had not known were permanent knowledge until recently, when permanence had become a matter of survival. 5 feet down, Katie. The temperature doesn't change. Summer or winter, you go 5 feet down and the ground sits at 50 degrees, give or take. Doesn't matter what's happening above it. The earth holds heat the way air never can. She had been 13. They had been standing in one of the lower tunnels of the Leadville shaft, and her father had pressed her hand flat against the tunnel wall at shoulder height, telling her to feel the difference between the wall near the surface entrance and the wall here 20 feet down. She had felt it. Even then, as a child with no framework for what she was feeling, she had felt the unmistakable steadiness of it, the temperature that did not fluctuate with the day or the season or the mood of the sky above. That simply was what it was, because the earth was not performing for anyone. The earth doesn't lie, her father had said, and Eleanor had carried that sentence for 22 years without particularly needing it, and now she needed it very badly. She crossed to the northwest corner of the cabin and knelt on the floor and pressed both palms flat against the boards. Cold. Drafty in the way that the cabin's crawl space made everything cold, the structure was raised 6 inches on cedar posts, and beneath those posts was empty air, and empty air in a Montana winter was not insulation, but a highway for everything the winter intended to do to the people living above it. The floor was always the coldest part. Henry's feet were always the coldest part of Henry. The water bucket froze when she left it on the floor, But beneath the floor, beneath the crawl space and the cedar posts and the 6 inches of gap that let the wind tear through all night, there was earth. And the earth 5 feet down was 50 degrees. Eleanor stayed on her knees for a long time. She was not the kind of person who experienced ideas as sudden illuminations. She was the kind of person who circled a problem from a distance, examining it from multiple angles, until the shape of its solution became apparent through patience rather than inspiration. What she was feeling now was not excitement, because she was too tired and too cold and too worried about her children to feel excitement. What she was feeling was the specific steadying sensation of a problem that had seemed impossible, revealing the seam along which it could be opened. She got up and found her notebook and turned to a blank page near the back, away from the temperature records. She drew a rough rectangle and labeled the dimensions she was estimating from the corner of the room, 8 feet along one wall, 6 feet along the other. She drew a depth line descending from the floor. She wrote the number 5 beside it. She wrote 50 degrees Fahrenheit in the space below, which was the space that did not yet exist and needed to. Then she sat looking at the sketch for a poignant time and running through every objection she could think of, because she had learned that the worst time to discover an objection was after you had committed to something irreversible. The floor was raised on posts. She would need to remove boards to access the ground below. She had a shovel. The first several inches would be frozen solid and would resist her, but once she broke through the surface layer, the soil beneath would be softer. She had helped her father dig fence posts in frozen ground every November of her childhood. She knew what the first inches felt like, and she knew what came after. She would need to dispose of the excavated earth without attracting attention. Spreading it across the dormant garden in small amounts each morning would account for it as spring preparation. She would need stones for the walls, river stones from Bitterroot Creek a quarter-mile east, flat-sided enough to stack without mortar. She would need wood for a small platform for sleeping above the bare earth. She would need a ventilation pipe, something to keep the air from going stale, with 3 people breathing in a closed space. She had seen metal pipes at the abandoned Fielding homestead 2 miles north. She could salvage one. She was estimating 3 to 4 weeks of night work, working 2 to 3 hours after the children slept, depending on the soil conditions and her own endurance. She was estimating correctly, she thought, knowing she was probably estimating short. What she could not account for yet was the cold itself, because no plan she made could be implemented if the cold took Henry's lungs before she had time to build what she was building toward. So the fire had to keep burning and the wood had to last, and she had to hold both of those facts in tension with each other and find the narrow path between them. She did not sleep that night. She sat by the stove in Daniel's coat and thought through the plan from every direction, and by morning she had identified everything that could go wrong and acknowledged that most of it was likely to, and had decided to begin anyway. She had $7.30 in the wooden box on the shelf. She had a shovel, a pickaxe she had found in the tool shed, 3 canvas sacks for moving earth. She had the creek, which would give her all the stones she needed. She had 5 weeks until the worst of the winter would close in completely. She had her father's voice in her head, and her father had never been wrong about the earth. What she could not have known on that quiet late November morning, with the frost making patterns on her windows and her 2 children still asleep in the corner, was that the most immediate threat to everything she was planning would not come in the form of frozen ground or structural failure or a boulder embedded in the earth where she needed to dig. It would come on a Wednesday afternoon in early December on a wagon driven by a man who kept perfect ledgers and believed that precision about money was the same thing as justice. Harold Vance arrived on December 3rd in the late afternoon, driving a small wagon with a bay mare that had seen better seasons. He was 58 years old, thin and angular, in the way of men who had never carried weight they didn't need, and his face had the quality of something that had been subjected to decades of weather without softening any of its features. He owned the general store at the north edge of Bitterroot Creek, which meant that in practical terms, he owned a significant portion of the settlement's ability to survive winter, and he knew this about himself without being apologetic about it. He was not a cruel man. He was a man who had organized his entire understanding of fairness around the principle that obligations once incurred did not become less real because circumstances became difficult. Eleanor met him outside. She did not invite him in. He dismounted with the deliberate movements of a man who was not in a hurry because he did not need to be, and he reached into his coat and produced a small, leather-bound ledger and opened it to a page he clearly knew by heart. Mrs. Marsh. He looked at her with the flat, steady gaze of a man conducting business. I think you know why I've come. Tell me anyway. She kept her voice level, which required some effort. He consulted the ledger. Your husband owed me $47 at the time of his death. I extended courtesy for 6 months in recognition of your situation. With interest accrued at 10% over that period, the amount now stands at $52. Eleanor had run this number herself. I know what it is, and I don't have it. Vance closed the ledger partially, his finger marking the page. I assumed as much. That is not, however, the full picture. He opened to a different page. The $47 was the outstanding balance on a line of credit Daniel ran at the store. The line of credit was itself established to service a separate obligation, a loan of $120, that your husband took in February of this year to purchase logging equipment. He made one payment of $20 in March. He made no further payments before his death. Vance looked up at her. The principal outstanding on the loan is $100. 6 months at 10% adds $60. Combined with the store balance and its interest, the total amount owed to me by your husband's estate is $152. Eleanor felt the blood leave her face in a slow, complete way, the way water leaves a glass when it is tilted past the point of recovery. She did not speak, not because she had nothing to say, but because she needed a moment to understand what she had just heard, to find its shape and its edges and the thing that it meant. Daniel had borrowed $120 in February and had not told her, not one word. She looked at Vance's face and understood that the number was accurate, that he was not embellishing, that this was simply what the ledger said, and the ledger said what happened. She felt two things simultaneously, and with equal intensity, the practical terror of a debt she could not pay, and something harder to name, something that lived below the terror, which was the specific grief of discovering that the man she had loved had kept something from her that was significant and had apparently intended to handle it alone without her knowing it needed handling. She thought of Daniel leaving in the dark of April 3rd with a kiss and a smile, and the particular ease of a man who did not know he had less than 3 days left. She thought of the way he had always moved through difficulty, quietly internally, carrying weight he thought he could carry alone. She thought that she had loved this about him and resented it in equal measure, and now she was left holding what he had tried to spare her from holding. I don't have $152. She said it without drama because it was simply true. Vance folded the ledger. I'm aware. I'm prepared to be reasonable. If you sign the property transfer before January 1st, I'll permit you and the children to remain on the premises until the end of April. That gives you 4 months to arrange alternative accommodation. I'm not asking you to leave in the middle of winter. You're asking me to give you my house. I'm asking you to satisfy a debt your husband incurred. The house is the only asset available to satisfy it. He said it without heat, without pleasure, the way a man says something he has said many times to many people in many difficult situations and has long since separated himself from the feeling of it. I would genuinely prefer to be paid in currency, but the debt requires resolution. Eleanor looked at him in the fading December light, the bare trees behind him moving slightly in a wind that carried the smell of coming snow. She thought about the sketch in her notebook. She thought about 52 degrees 5 feet underground. She thought about what it meant to lose the structure that sat above the ground she intended to dig into, the thing that would shelter and conceal what she was building. She thought about 3 canvas sacks and a pickaxe and the whole complicated, impossible arithmetic of what she was trying to accomplish. And she felt something cold and definite settle into the center of her chest that was not grief and was not fear, but was something that arrived when both of those had been exhausted. Something that looked very much like stubbornness. I have something. The words came before she had fully decided to say them. I have knowledge. Something I'm building, something that could keep people alive through this winter in a way nothing else in this settlement does. I'll share it. I'll teach every family here. Whatever I learn, I'll give it away freely, no conditions, to everyone who needs it. That has to be worth something. Vance studied her with the first flicker of genuine curiosity she had seen from him. What are you talking about? She told him the outline of it, the Earth's stable temperature, the room beneath the floor, the principle her father had given her, and that she was now converting into something livable. She did not tell him how far along she was because the answer to that was not far along enough. She told him the principle and the intention and what it could do for the families in Bitterroot Creek when the worst weather came. Vance listened without interrupting. Then, Mrs. Marsh, I'm a merchant. I don't trade in knowledge. I trade in goods and money. If you had timber to offer or livestock or something I could put a value on and hold in my hand, we could negotiate. But an idea you haven't yet finished building cannot pay a debt. People are going to die this winter. She said it quietly, which made it more than a prediction. You know it. Every winter, someone freezes. Children die. What I'm building could change that for this settlement. Then share it freely when you finish building it. He pocketed the ledger. But it doesn't change what you owe me. I'll return on Christmas Day. I would like to find cash or a signed transfer waiting for me. One of those two things. He walked back to his wagon and climbed up without rushing the way a man climbs when he has said what he came to say. The wagon moved north along the frozen track and became a shape, and then a sound, and then nothing. Eleanor stood in the space where he had been and looked at the woodpile and looked at the cabin door and looked at the sky in the west, where the clouds had the particular dark density that preceded heavy weather. The wind had died while Vance was talking and had not returned. The birds were gone. She had lived in Montana long enough to know what that combination of signs meant, and it was not nothing. $7.30. $152. 22 days until Christmas. She went inside and fed the fire and checked Henry's breathing and listened to the silence of her sleeping children for a long moment. And then she walked to the northwest corner and pulled back the woven rug that covered the 3 boards she had already identified and loosened. She had been planning. She had been mapping, measuring, calculating. She had been doing everything except the one thing that needed doing, which was beginning. She was done planning. She went to the door and took Daniel's coat from the hook and put it on. She went to the tool shed and retrieved the shovel. She came back inside and positioned herself over the gap in the floor and gripped the handle and looked down at the frozen gray earth below. The cold coming up from the crawl space was considerable and direct, the unobstructed cold of a November night finding its most efficient path. It was exactly the cold she intended to eliminate. 5 feet down was 50 degrees. Between here and there was work, and she had done hard work before, and the people depending on her were asleep 6 feet away, and the thermometer on the wall read 38 degrees, and there was nothing left in the world to wait for. The first thrust of the blade into the frozen earth met resistance that traveled up the handle and into her palms and shoulders like a refusal. She pushed her full weight behind it. The steel bit through, not far, not cleanly, but through. She pried the blade sideways, and a clod of frozen soil broke loose, and she lifted it into the canvas sack beside her and repositioned her feet and drove the blade down again. 38 degrees inside, 50 degrees below. $152 she did not have. 22 days. She dug. The first 8 inches were the worst of it, and Eleanor had known they would be before she drove the blade in. Frozen ground did not yield by degree. It held completely, and then it broke. And what broke it was not cleverness, but repetition, the same angle, the same pressure, the same refusal to accept the resistance as a verdict. By the end of the first night, she had moved perhaps 2 cubic feet of earth, which she knew because she had filled the canvas sack twice, and her hands had begun to blister along the inner crease of each palm where the handle worked against skin that was not yet calloused enough for this specific punishment. She replaced the floorboards before the sky lightened, swept the loose soil from around the opening with a folded cloth, and pulled the woven rug back into position. When Clara woke an hour later and padded over to the stove to warm her hands, there was nothing visible in the northwest corner to suggest that anything had changed. That morning, Eleanor carried the first sack out to the dormant kitchen garden along the south wall and spread the excavated earth thin across the soil, working it in with the toe of her boot, making it look like the kind of preparation a careful farmer made before the ground locked up entirely for winter. Ruth Calloway's cabin was visible from the garden on a clear day. Eleanor worked quickly and went back inside. The digging continued in the hours the children slept after they went down at night and before they woke in the morning. Eleanor developed a system within the first 3 days, not because she was methodical by temperament, but because the work demanded it. She moved the sacks of excavated soil to the woodshed during the day and distributed them to the garden each morning in amounts small enough to look incidental. She kept the 3 loosened floorboards in order so she could replace them without noise in under a minute if one of the children stirred. She kept the candle stub she worked by low in shielded positions so its light would not show under the door. The second week the soil changed. Below the frozen surface layer, the earth came loose with a resistance that felt like stubbornness rather than concrete, and Eleanor moved nearly twice as much in the same hours. The soil here was darker, faintly damp to the touch, and when she pressed her bare fingers into the walls of the hole, she was creating the temperature registered as something other than the hostile cold of the boards above. Not warm by any comfortable standard, but different. She held her hand against the wall and felt the difference, and it gave her enough to keep going. Henry's cough had not worsened since she began. She could not say that the digging was responsible for this because she had not changed anything above the floor. But she chose to read it as a sign the way a person chooses what to read when the alternatives are unreadable. Clara noticed her hands on a Tuesday morning, looking up from the alphabet she was practicing in charcoal on brown paper. "Mama, your hands look like Mr. Henderson's hands." She said it with the matter-of-fact directness of a child who had not yet learned to dress observations in apology. Eleanor looked down at her palms, at the hardened ridges that had formed along the lines where the shovel handle had taught her skin what it needed to become. She said she'd been doing some repair work around the cabin, which was true in the way that every statement is true if its scope is not examined too closely. Clara looked at her for a moment with those grave, watchful eyes and then went back to her letters without pressing it. But something in the girl's posture suggested she had stored the observations somewhere it would keep. The trouble arrived on the 17th day. Eleanor had been working steadily for nearly 2 hours when the blade struck something that was not soil. The impact traveled up the handle with a sharp metallic quality, unlike anything the earth had given her so far. Not the dull resistance of compacted clay, not the occasional buried root that gave under sustained pressure, but something absolute and unyielding. She worked the blade sideways, chipping away at the surrounding earth, and what emerged over the next 20 minutes was the top surface of a granite boulder embedded in the ground at roughly 2 feet of depth, its upper face roughly the size of a wash basin, but clearly extending laterally in all directions by a margin she could not yet determine. She spent the remainder of that night mapping its edges, and what she found was worse than she had hoped. The stone extended at least 2 feet east, at least 18 inches west, and descended into the earth at an angle that made its lower limit invisible. It was not positioned at the corner of her intended space, but near its center, which meant she could not simply redesign around it without abandoning the dimensions entirely. She replaced the boards and lay awake in her chair until morning running options through her mind with the methodical grimness of someone who has already eliminated the easy answers and is working through the others in the order of how much they cost. The next 3 days, she attacked the boulder with the pickaxe, striking it at angles she had seen her father use when encountering stone in the mine, looking for a fracture line to seem any point of structural weakness. Granite did not offer these. The stone absorbed every blow and remained. Her right shoulder began producing a pain that was not the familiar ache of overwork, but something deeper from inside the joint, and she modified her grip and kept working because stopping was not a category she was allowing herself. On the 4th day, she sat at the edge of the hole with the candle burning beside her and the pickaxe across her knees, and she felt something she had been successfully preventing herself from feeling since April, which was the specific despair of a person who has calculated their options correctly and found that none of them are sufficient. Not grief exactly, more like the arithmetic of the situation finally demanding that she acknowledge a sum she had been refusing to carry. She did not hear Clara get out of bed. The girl moved quietly when she chose to, with the uncanny awareness of a child who has spent months reading the emotional weather of the adults around her. She appeared at the edge of the lamplight and looked down into the hole and then looked at her mother, and what she said next came without preamble, in the simple declarative tone she used when she had thought something through and had arrived at what seemed to her like an obvious conclusion. "Can't you dig around it? Make the room a different shape." Eleanor looked at her daughter, then she looked at the stone. Then she looked back at Clara, who was holding the worn copy of fairy tales she had been reading by lamplight since October. And Eleanor understood that the solution had been available the entire time she had been trying to break what could not be broken, and that it had taken a child holding a storybook to see what fatigue and commitment to the original plan had made invisible. The shape of the room was not a fixed requirement. The requirement was space enough for 3 people to sleep. If the stone occupied one corner, the room became an L around it. Less elegant, not less functional. The boulder was not an obstacle. It was a wall she had not chosen but could work with. Eleanor pressed her hand to Clara's forehead. Her daughter leaned into it slightly. "You're smarter than I am right now." Clara shook her head with the solemnity of an 8-year-old taking the compliment seriously. "You're just too tired to see straight." Then she went back to bed and pulled the covers up and was asleep again before Eleanor had finished processing the fullness of what had just happened. She worked around the stone for the next week, adjusting the shape of the excavation to accommodate it, and what emerged was a room that was irregular and entirely adequate. Samuel Holt discovered her secret on a night in the first week of December, and the way it happened mattered more than the fact of it. He had been walking the perimeter of the settlement after dark, which was a habit of his that Eleanor did not know about because no one had mentioned it. It was not surveillance. It was the habit of a man who built things and then could not stop worrying about whether they would hold, who felt a responsibility for the structures he had raised that persisted long after he had been paid and moved on to the next one. He checked roof lines after wind. He noted which chimneys were drawing properly and which were backing up. He did not do this for credit or recognition. He did it because the alternative was lying in his cabin, wondering. He was passing along the eastern side of Eleanor's property when he saw her emerge from the woodshed carrying a canvas sack over one shoulder, moving toward the creek path with the deliberate stride of someone accustomed to the weight. It was 11:30 at night, and the temperature was 11 degrees, and she was walking to the creek in the dark. He followed at a distance that he told himself was respectful, and that was also something closer to concern, and he watched her kneel at the creek bank and work stones from the shallow water, with bare hands sorting by size and shape, with the selectivity of someone who knew exactly what they needed, and fill the sack until it was heavy enough that standing required effort. She was building something. He had built enough things himself to recognize the gathering of specific materials in specific quantities. River stones, flat-sided, roughly uniform in size, suitable for stacking, these were not decorative. These were structural. The next morning, he came to her door. She opened it and looked at him with the particular wariness of someone who had been managing alone long enough that any unexpected arrival registered first as a potential complication. "I saw you at the creek last night." He said it without accusation, the way he said most things. She considered the available responses and rejected each of them in sequence, because he was looking at her with the level, undemanding gaze of a man who was not there to judge anything, only to understand it. She stepped back from the door. "Come inside." She showed him the loosened boards. She showed him the hole, which was now 3 feet deep in its shallowest section and nearly 4 in the area around the reshaped L, with the granite boulder occupying the southeast corner like an unelected tenant. She told him the principle: the Earth's stable temperature at depth, the insulation of stone walls, the way heat from the stove above would conduct downward through the boards, the ventilation problem, and how she intended to address it with salvaged pipe from the fielding place. She did not apologize for any of it or minimize it or look to his face for permission while she was explaining. Samuel listened without interrupting. When she finished, he knelt at the edge of the opening and looked down into it for a long time, examining the walls of the excavation, the angle of the sides, the way she had managed the corner where the rock changed the geometry. He pressed his thumb into the soil at one point and felt how it compacted. He looked at the horizontal span of the work she had done, which represented more cubic feet of removed earth than most people would have expected a single person working at night to accomplish in 3 weeks. He stood and looked at her directly. "The principle is sound." He said it the way a person says something they have tested against their knowledge and found to be true, rather than something they are offering as encouragement. "I helped the Brenners put a partial root cellar against their north wall 2 years ago. The soil temperature at 3 feet was 49 degrees in January. 5 feet will be warmer." A pause. "You've gotten this far alone." "I have." Her voice carried no particular pride in this. It was simply true. "Will you let me help you finish it?" She told him she had no money to pay him. He told her he hadn't asked about money, and his voice, when he said it, carried the mild firmness of a man who considered the subject settled. What he asked for instead, quietly and without ceremony, was for her to teach him what she was learning so that he could build one for his own cabin. Eleanor looked at him for a moment and then told him that was a reasonable exchange. They began working together that night. What Samuel brought to the project was not simply strength, though two people moved earth faster than one. He brought 20 years of construction knowledge that manifested in specific practical ways, the knowledge of how to key stones together so that the weight of the wall worked in the wall's favor rather than against it, the knowledge of which gaps needed packing and which needed to breathe, the understanding of how ventilation worked in an enclosed space and how much pipe diameter was required to serve how many occupants without producing the carbon accumulation that made enclosed winter shelters dangerous. He had been in enough poorly ventilated structures to know what that danger looked like and to take it seriously. He also brought on the third night they worked together a length of salvaged iron pipe and a valve fitting he had found at the Fielding homestead himself without being asked. He set them against the cabin wall and said nothing about it, and when Eleanor looked at him, he explained that he had been thinking about the ventilation capacity required for 3 people and had concluded she would need 2 intake points, not 1, and that he had built a second valve into the fitting so the airflow could be adjusted by opening both or reducing to 1 depending on conditions. He added that if there were ever more than 3 people in the space, both would need to be open, and even then the air should be checked periodically. He said this in the tone of a man who was thinking ahead to contingencies he preferred not to name directly. Eleanor understood what he was not saying. She understood that he was building something into the system that anticipated a worse night than the one she was planning for. She did not ask him to articulate it. She helped him position the pipe against the foundation at the angle he had calculated. They were not easy with each other at first. They had the careful formality of 2 private people suddenly sharing something intimate, which was not physical intimacy, but the intimacy of working at close quarters in the dark toward a goal that mattered urgently to one of them, and evidently for reasons he did not explain to the other as well. It wore down gradually, not through conversation, so much as through the accumulated hours of working in the same direction, which teaches a person things about someone else that talking doesn't. She learned that he had been a carpenter in Ohio before coming west, that he had been married, that his wife had died in the summer of 1882 from a fever that took her in 4 days, and that he had moved to Montana the following spring because he needed to be somewhere no part of the landscape matched his memory. He said this without self-pity, in the same tone he used when describing the properties of different types of stone. He had built houses for other people since then because building for himself felt like a question he couldn't answer. Eleanor listened to this and said nothing for a while because there was nothing useful to say, and Samuel did not seem to need a response. He seemed to need only to have said it, which was different. She told him about Daniel's loan, which she had not told anyone. She told him not as a confession, but because it had been sitting inside her like a splinter, and she needed to say it to someone who was not going to tell Ruth Calloway. The full weight of it, the $120 borrowed in February, the logging equipment, the plan to pay it off quietly, without worrying her, the death in April that left both the debt and the plan unfinished. Samuel listened, and when she was done, he set down the stone he had been fitting and looked at the wall in front of him for a moment. He was trying to carry something he thought he shouldn't put on you. His voice was not excusing it. He was describing what it looked like from the outside. That's not wisdom necessarily, but it's a particular kind of love. Eleanor pressed her palm against the stone wall and felt its steadiness. She didn't answer because the thing he had said was true in a way that sat inside her differently from the way she had been carrying it before. She noticed in passing that Samuel had written something at the small table in the corner of his cabin on the evening of December 11th. She saw the paper through his open door when she came to retrieve the extra pipe fittings he had offered. She did not ask about it. He did not volunteer its contents. She filed this away with the same instinct she had applied to everything Reverend Alcott had told her on Thanksgiving, not pressing, just keeping. The evening of December 17th, everything was ready. The walls were finished, stones stacked and wedged, the gaps packed with pine bark and dried moss that Samuel had gathered in quantity from the creek bottom, forming an insulating layer between the stone face and the raw earth behind it. The wooden platform occupied the space away from the boulder, 2 feet off the earthen floor constructed from lumber Samuel had brought in pieces without explaining where it had come from. The ventilation pipe ran upward at the angle he had designed, passing through the foundation and disguised on the exterior as drainage infrastructure. The ladder was solid, the rungs tested at weight. The trapdoor fit cleanly in the floor with a hinge and a recessed handle that disappeared beneath the rug's edge. Eleanor lit a candle stub and descended the ladder for the first time. The air hit her differently below. Not cold, not warm, but something between those that registered as absence of wind, which felt after weeks of working in draft and chill almost unnatural. She had not been underground since she was a girl in her father's mine. The sensation was similar. The quality of enclosed earth, the faint mineral smell, the way sounds stopped at the walls rather than passing through them. Samuel handed the thermometer down without a word. She hung it on the nail they had set in the upper course of the wall and waited while it registered. She watched the mercury find its level. When it stopped, she raised the candle to read the number. 52 degrees Fahrenheit. The world above was 15 degrees. The cabin near the stove had been running at 48. Here in the shaped space that was not supposed to exist, the earth was doing exactly what her father had told her it would do 22 years ago in a silver mine in Colorado, holding the temperature that belonged to it, the one that weather and season and the cruelty of the sky had no claim on. She stood in the underground room and felt the steady air against her face and understood that she had built a fact and that facts were more durable than almost anything else. She did not cry. She had expected to and found that she didn't need to. She pressed her hand against the stone wall and felt the steadiness coming back into her palm, and she thought about her father and what he would have said about this, and what he would have said was exactly nothing, because it had worked, and when things worked, there was nothing required except to continue. She climbed up and looked at Samuel. He was watching her face. It works. His voice was quiet. It works. That night she brought Clara and Henry down for the first time. She went first, then helped Clara onto the first rung and talked her down, then brought Henry last, his small hands gripping each rung with the careful concentration of a child doing something new and wanting to do it correctly. When they were all standing on the wooden platform and she had closed the trap door above them, Clara looked at the stone walls with the oil lamp making their shadows move and said, "It's quiet." She said it like a discovery. Henry reached out and touched the nearest stone and looked at his mother. "It's not cold." He said it in the tone children use when reality has corrected an assumption. These were not dramatic responses. They were the responses of children registering something important with the exact right language. They slept that night on the platform with blankets arranged around them, and neither of them woke shivering in the small hours, and Henry did not cough once. Outside, the temperature dropped to 12 degrees. In the room beneath the floor, the thermometer Eleanor checked at 2 in the morning read 58. The stone walls held it. The earth gave it. They slept. Harold Vance came back on December 22nd, 2 days ahead of schedule, and in the first light snowfall of a sky that had been building towards something. All week, he climbed down from his wagon with the deed transfer already folded in his coat pocket, which told Eleanor everything about how he had organized his expectations for the visit. She met him at the door before he could knock because she had seen the wagon from the window. He explained that he was leaving for Helena in the morning and wanted to settle the matter before he went. His voice carried the pragmatic gentleness of a man who had decided in advance to be reasonable and needed her to understand this was a favor. The deed transfer would allow her to remain through April. "It's a fair arrangement given the circumstances, Mrs. Marsh. You want me to sign away my house in December with 2 children and call it fair?" Vance's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I want you to satisfy a debt your husband incurred. The house is the mechanism." He held out the folded paper. "I'm not enjoying this." She looked at the paper. She thought about what was beneath the floor she was standing on. She thought about 52 degrees in the earth and what it had cost her to put it there, and she made a decision she had not fully made until the moment she made it. "I have a counteroffer." His eyes shifted with the reluctant curiosity of a man who had not expected a counteroffer. She told him, "Forgive the debt, not reduce it, not extend it, eliminate it, and in exchange she would formalize everything she had built and learned into a document he could put his name on for contributing to distribute to every family in the settlement. Teach anyone who asked her personally at no charge for as long as she was capable of teaching. The knowledge was worth lives. She was asking him to weigh it against a number in a ledger and decide which one his name could stand behind better when the winter was over. Vance was quiet for longer than she expected. She had prepared herself for an immediate refusal, and the silence disturbed her more than refusal would have. Then, I understand what you're offering, Mrs. Marsh. I understand that you believe it has value, and you may be right about that. But if I accept knowledge as payment today, I will be accepting corn from Henderson and labor from Wright tomorrow, and I cannot run a store on goodwill. The principle matters beyond your particular situation. He returned the unsigned transfer to his pocket. I'll come back Christmas Day. I hope you'll have had time to find another resolution. He said it without satisfaction, which she almost wished he hadn't because his lack of satisfaction made it harder to direct her anger cleanly. She watched him drive north in the thickening snow, and she stood there long enough to feel the cold settling across her shoulders, through Daniel's coat, and then she went inside because there was nothing the cold air could tell her that she didn't already know. The sky that evening was something she had not seen before. Not the iron gray overcast of ordinary winter clouds, but something denser and more purposeful. A darkness in the west that moved like intention rather than weather, banking against the mountains and filling the lowlands and arriving at Bitterroot Creek with the kind of silence that preceded the largest events of the natural world. The birds had been gone since morning. The wind had stopped entirely at mid-afternoon and had not returned, and this absence of wind was more alarming than wind would have been, because the things that made wind stop in Montana in December were things you did not want to be above ground for. Samuel came by in the late afternoon with lumber for reinforcing the trapdoor and a canvas bundle under his arm. He set the bundle inside and told her it contained an additional valve fitting and the second ventilation pipe he had built along with extra packing material and a hand drill for installing it. He said this without explaining why he had brought it today specifically, but his eyes moved to the western sky when he said it and did not linger on it, which was its own kind of explanation. She asked how bad. He looked at her with the level candor of a man who had decided she deserved accurate information. Bad enough that the telegraph operator in town told anyone who asked to prepare for a week indoors. Maybe more. Then quieter, make sure you have enough lamp oil. He checked the ladder one more time and left before dark. Eleanor took inventory. Flour, cornmeal, dried beans, the preserved apples Ruth had brought. Enough for 12 days if she was careful, longer if the children ate less than they wanted. Lamp oil was the problem, 4 days, perhaps 5. After that darkness, she added it to the list of things she could not solve and moved past it to the things she could. She brought water inside in every container she owned and stacked them near the stove. She brought extra wood to the pile inside the cabin door. She secured everything she could see that might tear loose in wind. The snow started in earnest after midnight, not the tentative small flake snow of a normal December storm, but the full committed delivery of a sky that had been accumulating something large for a long time and had finally decided to put it down. By 3 in the morning, it was coming in curtains that reduced the window view to white motion, and by morning the world had been simplified to a single color. Eleanor went down with the children at first light on the 22nd because the cabin temperature had fallen to 38 degrees despite the fire, and she understood within an hour of fighting to maintain it that the fire was not going to win this argument. The wind had found the cabin in ways it had not found it before, through gaps that had held all fall through the chimney draws, through the floor in channels she had not noticed until they opened under pressure. The children were shivering at the breakfast table. Henry had started coughing again, the wet rattling kind that lived deeper than a normal cold. She made the decision cleanly and without ceremony. The way she had made every decision since November that mattered, she banked the fire down to a low, steady burn, gathered their food, their water, the lamp oil, all of the blankets, and she moved them underground. They settled on the platform with the blankets arranged around them, and the trap door closed above, and the temperature in the room when Eleanor checked it was 50 degrees, which was 2 degrees lower than it had been, but still 32 degrees warmer than the cabin floor above. Henry burrowed against her side, and his coughing slowed in the settled air. Clara opened her book and held it at a reading angle by lamplight, with the composure of someone who had decided to be all right with whatever situation she found herself in. The wind above them, even 5 feet underground, was audible, a low, sustained roar, like something moving through the valley on a mission it had no interest in explaining. Eleanor rationed the lamp oil, burning it in 2-hour windows with darkness between, and in the dark they told stories, and Clara asked questions about things she had been too polite to ask before, and Henry fell asleep against Eleanor's shoulder with the deep heaviness of a body that had been cold too long and was finally warm enough to stop fighting. On what Eleanor believed was the second night of the storm, the sound came that she had not been expecting. Not the wind, which she had long since accepted as background. Something else, a rhythmic impact at the cabin door above, too deliberate and too human pattern to be weather. She sat up and heard it again. She climbed the ladder fast. The cabin was a sealed shell of ice. She could see her breath at arm's length from the cold. She crossed to the door and opened it against the weight of the drifted snow, and Ruth Calloway fell through it. 3 children behind her, all of them coated in snow to their waists, their faces the particular grayish pale that lived one level above the color of a body that had stopped trying to warm itself. Ruth's youngest, a boy of 2 years named Thomas, lay in her arms without moving his lips, without color, his breathing a thin thread of a thing that Eleanor could barely detect when she pressed her ear to his face. The other 2 children were upright but shaking in a way that was not voluntary, their bodies working every available mechanism against a cold they had been in too long. Ruth's chimney had cracked on the second day of the storm she managed. Carbon monoxide in the cabin, they couldn't breathe. She got the children out and into the snow and started walking, and Eleanor's cabin was the only one she could get to. She said this in a voice that was barely above a whisper, not from drama, but because she did not have the reserves for volume. Eleanor did not speak. She pulled all 4 of them inside, closed the door on the howling white, and got them to the trap door. Samuel's second ventilation pipe and the adjustable valve fitting went in fast because Eleanor had been working at the far edge of her limits for long enough that her hands knew how to do things her mind was still catching up with. She opened both valves to their maximum aperture. 7 people in a space built for 3 required everything the system could provide. She made the calculation about trips above twice in the night to check the banked fire and let the stove draw briefly, which would pull a change of air through the cabin and settle into the space below through convection. Twice in the night was possible. More would have been dangerous at the outdoor temperatures she knew were out there. Thomas took 4 hours to come back. Eleanor held him against her chest with both arms for the first 2 hours, sharing her body temperature in the most direct way available, and Ruth sat beside them with one hand on the boy's back and her eyes on his face with an expression that Eleanor recognized as the specific, focused attention of a mother who had decided not to look away from the thing she was most afraid of because looking away would not change it. The other children slept in a pile with Claire and Henry, their combined warmth making a kind of collective survival that individual blankets could not have managed. At some point in the deep middle of the night, Thomas made a sound, not quite a cry, something smaller, something that indicated his body had made a decision about continuing. Ruth turned her face away. Her shoulders shook once silently, and then she turned back and looked at her son, and her expression moved from terror to something that was still not ease, but was at least on the same continent as relief. By the time what passed for morning arrived, the boy was breathing in a rhythm that no longer needed to be monitored constantly. Eleanor climbed above once to tend the fire and assess the storm, and what she found was a cabin encased in ice on its interior walls, wind coming through cracks that had not existed before this week, and a world outside the door that was 5 feet of white in every direction with no horizon visible anywhere. She came back down and closed the trap door and sat on the platform with her back against the stone wall and felt the temperature the earth was providing and found that it was holding at 47 degrees with 7 people breathing in it, and she considered this sufficient. Ruth, in the long, quiet hours while the children slept, looked at Eleanor across the dim lamplight and said what she had apparently been arriving at for some time. "I thought you were losing your mind. I thought the grief had done something to your judgment." She said it without apology because it was what she had believed in saying. It was not accusation, it was accounting. "I almost said something to Reverend Alcott." Eleanor nodded once. Ruth continued, "I was wrong about every piece of it." Eleanor didn't answer directly. There was nothing productive to say about what either of them had thought or not thought in November. What existed was here now, 7 people alive in a room that should not exist in the middle of a storm that had taken the world above and reduced it to something uninhabitable. And Eleanor had built the room that was keeping them here instead of there. The storm ran its course over 4 days that Eleanor tracked imperfectly in the lamplight, losing the line between nights and days until time became less a sequence than a texture. They ate carefully and drank the stored water and told stories and waited. Clara read aloud to the other children by lamplight when the lamp was burning, which gave all of them something to hold on to that was not the wind. Henry's cough quieted to almost nothing in the stable air, and he slept most of the third day with his head in Eleanor's lap, which was the most peaceful she had seen him since September. On what she believed was the 26th of December, the roaring above them stopped. The silence came down like something physical, a pressure change, a shift in the quality of the air. Eleanor climbed up and opened the trap door into a cabin that was frozen solid but standing, and then opened the exterior door against 4 feet of drifted snow and stepped out into a world that had been remade entirely in white. The sky was a blue so pure and sharp, it seemed like a new color, something the storm had cleaned into existence. The cold was still extreme, she felt it immediately in her face and hands, but the wind was gone, and without the wind, the cold was a different thing, bearable the way a fact is bearable once it has stopped moving. She looked across Bitterroot Creek settlement. She counted the chimneys with smoke rising from them. She counted the ones that were still. Not all of them, not nearly all. She stood in the doorway of the cabin she had almost lost and looked at what the storm had done to the place where she lived, and she felt the full weight of the room beneath her feet, what it had given her, what it had paced, and what it meant that the knowledge of it had stayed with her alone while the world above tried to survive without it. She turned and called down for the others to come up. The world they were returning to was not the same one they had gone underground to escape. And Eleanor understood, standing in that doorway, with cold sun on her face and smoke rising from too few chimneys, that the work she had thought was finished was only a different kind of beginning. The settlement emerged from the blizzard the way things emerge from burial, slowly in pieces, with the disoriented quality of something that had been underground and was not entirely certain what it would find above. On December 27th, Eleanor stood at the edge of her property and watched her neighbors appear from their cabins, one by one, moving through snow that reached their waists in the low places and their knees everywhere else, calling out to each other across the white silence to confirm what they needed. Confirm, which was that the other person was still a person and not something the storm had finished. The Henderson family was 3 cabins east. Eleanor knew them the way you know people in a small settlement by sight and season, and the particular texture of proximity rather than by intimacy. She knew that Mr. Henderson had a laugh that carried that his eldest son had the same build and the same laugh that his wife made preserves in August and shared them without being asked. She knew these things, and when the word came down the settlement path that both men had been found frozen near the cabin door, she felt it the way she felt things that were too large to process standing up as a weight that arrived slowly and then did not leave. They had run out of dry wood on the 3rd day and burned furniture to maintain heat. The furniture was green pine unseasoned, and the smoke it produced in an enclosed space was not compatible with breathing, and the 2 men had apparently understood this and attempted to get outside and had not been able to get far enough. Mrs. Henderson and her 2 younger children had survived in the back room with the door sealed by the smoke's own chemistry, a fact that contained no comfort whatsoever and was reported as though it should. Old Mrs. Peaton on the east side of the creek had died without drama, which was somehow the hardest kind to hear about. She had been 73 and had refused 3 separate offers from families in the settlement to winter with them because she had been managing alone since 1871 and did not see any reason to change the arrangement. She was found in her rocking chair 2 days after the storm cleared, a quilt folded across her lap and her hands resting open on the armrest, the fire long dead beside her. The particular cruelty of it was not that she had suffered, no one believed she had, but that she had been 15 minutes from 3 separate households and 14 feet from a woodpile she had simply not been warm enough to reach. The Williams family lost their youngest daughter. She had been 4 years old and had developed a respiratory sickness on the 2nd day of the storm, the kind that in a warm house with adequate rest was a miserable week and nothing more. And in the conditions the Williams cabin had maintained by the 4th day was something that a 4-year-old body had not been equipped to survive. Henry had played with her in the grass behind the creek in July, chasing the grasshoppers she tried to catch, and he could not. Eleanor had watched them from the bank. She had that image of the girl specific and clear, and now permanently attached to the weight she was carrying. Marcus Carlson lost 3 fingers from his right hand, the first and second, and half of the third removed at the first knuckle by the settlement's doctor 4 days after the storm, when the tissue had declared its condition beyond recovery. Carlson was the blacksmith. His right hand was his livelihood and his family's livelihood and the source of every practical service he provided to a settlement that depended on ironwork in ways that only became visible when they could no longer be taken for granted. He had 4 children. His wife, Margaret, was a woman of 42 who had the specific competence and directness of someone who had spent decades converting difficult circumstances into manageable ones. And Eleanor had always respected her for it, and none of that respect was available to her now as preparation for what was coming. 4 dead, 12 with injuries ranging from frostbite to respiratory damage that would persist into spring and possibly beyond. Out of 23 families in Bitterroot Creek, 9 had come through entirely unharmed. Eleanor heard these numbers accumulate through the 27th and 28th in the way that devastating arithmetic always arrives incrementally, each piece seeming like it might be the last until the next piece came. She heard them and she held each one, and she did not try to manage how they felt because managing how things felt had become a way of not feeling them, and she was done with that particular economy. She had not told people what she knew. She had not told them what she was building. She had been afraid, and 4 people were dead, and she was not going to pretend that those 2 facts existed in separate compartments. Reverend Alcott held a memorial service on the morning of December 28th. The church held every surviving member of the settlement in a space that was designed for half of them, and Alcott stood at the front with a grief on his face that Eleanor had not seen there before, the grief of a man who had ministered to people through difficulty and was now reckoning with a difficulty that his ministry had not been sufficient for. He spoke the names of the dead with the deliberate care of someone who understood that the names were doing work that the eulogy could not, and his voice broke on the Williams girl's name, and he did not try to prevent this. Eleanor sat in the back row with Clara pressed against her left side and Henry asleep against her right arm, and she looked at the rough plank floor and thought about what she owed the people in this room. Afterward, outside in the hard December sun, she could hear her name moving through the conversations around her in the way that names move when they are attached to information people are still deciding what to do with. Ruth had told Margaret Carlson, and Margaret had told the people she talked to, which was everyone. Eleanor heard fragments as she moved toward the path home, not trying to hear them, unable not to. The Marsh woman built something. Underground. Ruth Calloway's children are alive because of it. She knew. She kept it to herself. Samuel appeared at her side with the quietness he had, the way of a man who moved through space without announcing himself. People are talking about you. He said it without inflection, simply as information she should have. I know. Some of them are angry. A pause. Margaret Carlson especially. Eleanor did not answer because there was no answer that would be both honest and comforting, and she had committed to honesty. Margaret Carlson found her 20 minutes later outside the church steps in the cold sunlight in a way that was clearly not accidental. She was a sturdy woman who had always carried herself with the forward-leaning posture of someone accustomed to walking into difficulty rather than around it, and the grief and fury in her face were so thoroughly mixed that they had become a single thing, and Eleanor recognized it because she had felt that single thing herself. You knew. Margaret's voice was pitched for Eleanor, but arrived in the ears of the 8 or 10 people within range of it. You knew something that could have helped them. You had the knowledge and you kept it to yourself, and now my husband cannot hold his tools, and the Henderson men are in the ground. And that little girl, her voice broke on the little girl and then reformed on the other side of the break, harder than before. We are supposed to be a community, Mrs. Marsh. We are supposed to help each other. Eleanor did not look away from her. She did not arrange her face into anything that was not what she was actually feeling, which was the particular combination of guilt and grief that comes from understanding that a person's accusation is not unfair, that it has found the seam it was looking for. You're right. The words came out level, not with the flatness of dismissal, but with the flatness of someone who had already said them to herself many times and had not found a rebuttal. I was afraid that if I told people what I was doing, I'd be stopped before I could finish it. A woman digging under her house at night, I knew how that would look. I chose my own fear over the community's safety, and I was wrong. I don't have a different answer than that. Margaret stared at her. The staring had the quality of a person testing whether the admission was real or tactical. When she determined that it was real, something shifted in her face that was not forgiveness. Forgiveness was too large a transaction for this moment, but was something that looked like the anger finding a new shape, one that was sadder and less combustible. She turned and walked away, and Eleanor let her go. Samuel stood 2 steps behind Eleanor, not intervening, not endorsing, simply present in the way that mattered most, which was present without conditions. He said nothing. She was glad he said nothing. The community meeting Reverend Alcott called that evening at the church had the tone of a thing that had been necessary for some time and had finally become unavoidable. People arrived with the specific energy of a group that had survived something together and needed to understand what it meant and what, if anything, came next. Harold Vance arrived from Helena mid-afternoon. Eleanor had seen his wagon from the window and took a seat in the front row with his ledger on his knee and the closed, attentive expression of a man who was there to observe before he was there to participate. Samuel stood and addressed the room first, which Eleanor had not arranged, but was grateful for because what Samuel provided that she could not provide for herself was the credibility of someone who had no obvious stake in the outcome. He was the man who had built their homes. He was the man they trusted with the physical structures of their lives. When he described what was beneath Eleanor's floor, the dimensions, the materials, the temperature readings he had taken himself with a calibrated thermometer, the principle of geothermal stability that made it function. He was not describing a theory. He was describing a fact he had witnessed and participated in building, and the room received it accordingly. He gave them numbers because numbers were what the situation required. 52 degrees below ground when 15 degrees prevailed above. 47 degrees with 7 occupants breathing in the space during the worst of the blizzard. A temperature differential of over 30 degrees maintained across 4 days of the most severe conditions in 4 decades without burning a single additional piece of wood, without any mechanical system, without anything except the earth doing what the earth had always done. He let the numbers speak without editorializing around them, and the room was quiet in the way that rooms are quiet when information has arrived that reorganizes something. Eleanor stood when Samuel sat. She had not rehearsed what she would say because rehearsed speeches required a kind of distance from the material that she did not have tonight. I kept it secret. I was afraid that if I said what I was doing, someone would tell me it wasn't proper or wasn't safe or wasn't something a woman alone should be attempting. She looked at the room at the faces that ranged from sympathetic to still angry to professionally neutral, and she kept her voice at the register of someone making an accounting rather than a defense. I was afraid of being stopped before I knew it would work. That fear cost this settlement something real, and I cannot tell you it didn't. What I can tell you is that I am finished being afraid of this particular thing, and anyone who wants to learn how to build what I built is welcome to come to me. I will teach everything I know to anyone who asks for as long as I am capable of teaching it. The room was not uniformly moved by this. It was a room of people who had been through something difficult and were still in the process of deciding how they felt about the woman in front of them, and human rooms do not reach consensus quickly on things that are complicated. But the silence that followed had more space in it than the silence before she had spoken. Vance stood when she finished, and the room's attention shifted to him with the particular attentiveness that debt commands. He opened his ledger to the page he knew. Mrs. Marsh owes me $152. The Christmas deadline has passed. The property is forfeit under the terms of the original agreement. He said it without pleasure and without apology, with the flat precision of someone reading a fact that existed independent of anyone's feelings about it. Reverend Alcott rose from his seat at the side of the room. Surely some accommodation. I've offered accommodation. Vance did not raise his voice. I've offered 4 months of continued residence in exchange for the deed transfer. The debt has had 6 months to be addressed. The law doesn't change because circumstances are hard. The room's relationship with Harold Vance was complicated by the fact that everyone in it depended on his store for things they could not produce themselves and knew it, and complicated further by the recognition that what he was saying was legally accurate, and complicated most of all by the sight of Eleanor Marsh standing in front of them after 4 days underground, keeping children alive. These complications did not resolve each other. They sat in the room together unresolved. Ruth Calloway stood. She was still carrying some of the pallor of the past 4 days, and her voice was not fully recovered, but what it had in volume it made up for in absolute certainty. My youngest child is alive. He was dying when I walked into Eleanor's cabin on Christmas Eve, and by morning he was crying. And the only reason I can tell you that is because of what she built under her floor. She paused. I have $20. I'm putting it toward her debt right now, and I'd like to ask whether anyone else in this room wants to stand with me. The moment that followed was one of those moments in a community's life that reveals what the community actually is rather than what it imagines itself to be. Samuel stood and offered $15. Thomas Wright, the farmer, who had contributed observations about root cellars back in November and had spent the storm in a situation that had given him a different perspective on underground construction, offered 10. Others stood in sequence, some with significant amounts, some with what was clearly the last of anything liquid they possessed. An elderly woman near the back offered 50 cents and apologized that it was all she had, and no one in the room thought this was insufficient. Margaret Carlson did not stand for a long time. Eleanor watched her from the front of the room without making the watching obvious. Margaret sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes directed at the floor in the particular posture of someone conducting an internal argument with a part of themselves they were not certain they were going to beat. Then she stood. She did not look at Eleanor. She looked at Reverend Alcott, who was keeping the running total. $3. She sat back down. Alcott added the column and announced the total, $107. $45 short. Vance was already rising to his feet when the voice came from the rear of the church. Arthur Kimball was 60 years old and had the bearing of a man who had spent a career entering rooms where he was not expected and had found it more efficient to simply proceed rather than to explain himself. He walked down the center aisle with his hat in one hand and the attention of every person in the room tracking him, and he stopped in front of the assembly at a position that placed him equidistant between Eleanor and Vance, which Eleanor did not think was accidental. "My name is Arthur Kimball. I'm a land assessor with the Federal Land Office out of Helena." He addressed the room with the unhurried confidence of someone who was accustomed to being taken seriously and did not need to establish it aggressively. "I've been in Bitterroot Creek since yesterday afternoon. I came because of a letter I received 3 weeks ago from a carpenter named Samuel Holt, describing a construction method being employed in this settlement that he believed warranted attention from the land office." He paused and looked at Samuel, who received the attention without visible reaction. He was not wrong. Eleanor looked at Samuel. He did not look back at her, which told her everything about why he had not mentioned the letter. He had not wanted to build her expectation towards something that might not come. He had simply written the letter and waited to see what arrived. Kimball continued, "I've spent the past 24 hours interviewing survivors and examining the structure Mrs. Marsh built under her cabin. I've reviewed the temperature records she kept during the storm. I want to be precise about what I found because precision matters here." He turned slightly toward the assembly. "The Federal Land Office has been attempting to address winter mortality in Montana Territory settlements for 6 years. We have distributed literature on chimney maintenance and wood storage and storm preparation, and people have continued to die at the same rate during severe winters because none of those measures address the fundamental problem, which is that the structures frontier settlers build are inadequate for the temperatures this region produces in a severe year." He let that sit for a moment. What Mrs. Marsh built addresses the fundamental problem, not by fighting the temperature by going below it to where the earth has already solved it. The room was very quiet. The land office has a documentation budget for techniques that demonstrate genuine utility for settler survival. I want to commission Mrs. Marsh to produce a complete written account of her method dimensions, materials, soil conditions, ventilation specifications, everything required for a family with ordinary tools and materials to replicate what she built. He looked at Eleanor directly. "I will pay $45 toward your outstanding debt and $35 to you directly upon completion of the documentation. The result will be printed and distributed to every land office in Montana Territory and sent to homesteaders receiving their land grants alongside the standard materials." The silence that followed was the kind that arrives when a room has been expecting one thing and has been given another and needs time to adjust its architecture accordingly. Eleanor found her voice in the place where all her reliable things had lived for the past 7 months, which was somewhere below her diaphragm, deeper than where fear operated. "I'll do it." Well, it took 2 words, and then because Kimball was a man who responded to directness. "I have conditions. The documentation will carry my name and Samuel Holt's name alongside mine because he provided half the engineering knowledge that made the structure sound." Kimball nodded once. "Agreed on both counts." Vance accepted the $45 in cash and marked his ledger with the satisfaction of a man whose primary relationship with emotion was relief that it had been resolved correctly. The debt was settled in front of everyone who lived and worked in Bitterroot Creek, which mattered to Eleanor not as a performance, but as a fact that had witnesses because facts with witnesses were more durable than facts without them. Eleanor did not feel triumph. She felt the specific grounded steadiness of a person whose immediate crisis had resolved in a direction that did not require abandoning everything they had built. She felt the $35 in her pocket as a weight that meant something more concrete than security. It meant that the knowledge in her hands had a value that existed outside of emergency, that what she understood about the earth was worth paying for in ordinary time, as well as desperate time. 3 days later, Vance came to her door alone, without the ledger, wearing the expression of a man who had been rehearsing something and was now going to say it regardless of how it came out. She let him in. He stood near the door with his hat in both hands, the posture of a man in a space where he did not expect to be comfortable and was not asking to be. He talked about a friend he had kept for 30 years, a man in Helena named Barrett, with whom he had done business and shared meals and to whom he had loaned money at reasonable rates over the decades. Barrett had a son of 15. The boy had been bright and healthy and had plans, the kind of plans that 15-year-old boys make that feel more like certainty than hope. The chimney in Barrett's house had failed on the third day of the blizzard. The boy had been in his room alone. By the time Barrett understood what was happening, the temperature in that room had done what temperatures do when they are given enough time and no one stops them. Vance was quiet for a moment after he said this, looking at the floor. I have kept perfect ledgers for 30 years. Every dollar accounted for, every obligation tracked, every debt resolved on schedule. He looked up at her. I thought that was the same thing as being a good man. I thought precision about money was the same thing as justice. Another pause, and something moved across his face that was not grief exactly, but was grief's older, quieter relative. I tried to take your house while you were saving children's lives. The debt was real. I was still wrong. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. She was not going to offer him easy absolution because easy absolution was a transaction that served the person receiving it more than the person giving it, and she had nothing left to spend on transactions that didn't serve her children. But she was also not going to refuse what he was offering, which was not absolution, but accountability, and those were different things. The debt was real, she agreed, and you were wrong about the rest. Both things are true. He reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch and set it on the table between them. $30 in coin and the offer of materials from his store, lumber, nails, rope, whatever she needed for the next 6 months at no charge. He said it was not a gesture. He said it was the closest he could come to a correction. Eleanor accepted it as what it was, which was imperfect and genuine and better than nothing, and better than nothing was not a small category. After he left, she stood at the window for a long time and watched the cold blue light of a January afternoon settle across the snow. She thought about Daniel and the loan he had taken to buy equipment that was supposed to keep him safe and had not kept him safe. And she thought about all the things that people did to protect the people they loved that did not work, and how the doing of them was still the truest thing about the person doing them. She thought about the room beneath her floor that had worked and what it had cost her to build it, and that the cost had been worth paying. She put on her coat and went out to the woodpile to bring in a load for the evening, and as she was doing this, she did not think of anything profound, because the work of survival did not require profound thought to accompany it, only the willingness to continue. The second major storm of that winter arrived in mid-January and lasted 4 days, driving temperatures to 15 below zero and depositing another 3 feet of snow across the valley. By the time it arrived, 11 families in Bitterroot Creek had underground rooms or partially buried shelters built against their north walls, the half measure that the shallowest foundation sites allowed. Margaret Carlson's family had one of the partial shelters built by Samuel over 3 days in the first week of January with lumber from Vance's store and the patient, thorough precision that Samuel applied to everything he built. When the January storm cleared, Eleanor walked the settlement and counted the smoke signals that rose from the chimneys in the emergency vents of the underground spaces, and the number she arrived at accounted for everyone. Not a single person was missing from that count. 3 people had minor frostbite from necessary trips between structures, and all 3 recovered fully within a week. The settlement doctor treated them without urgency, which was its own kind of news. Reverend Alcott mentioned it in his Sunday sermon on the 24th of January, and what he said was not elaborate, because elaboration would have diluted it. We have learned this winter that the simplest answers are the ones we overlook longest. We have learned that wisdom does not ask about the gender or station of the person carrying it, and we have learned that one person's willingness to trust what she knew, even when no one else was prepared to trust it with her, can change what is possible for an entire community. He looked at Eleanor when he said it, and then looked away, which was the right amount of looking. She did not need to be seen. She needed what she knew to be used. Spring arrived in increments, as it always did in Montana, giving a week of warmth and then reclaiming it, and then giving a little more testing the attachment of winter before allowing it to fully release. In March, Eleanor and Samuel worked together to draft the documentation Kimball had commissioned. Samuel provided the structural specifications, load calculations, stone selection criteria, the precise angles and diameters of the ventilation components, and Eleanor provided everything else, which was the reasoning behind the choices, the principle that governed the dimensions, the practical knowledge of soil behavior at different depths that her father had given her and that she had spent the last winter converting from theory into lived fact. Kimball came in April with a junior surveyor who took precise measurements of the room and sketched diagrams in a leather-bound drafting book. He reviewed Eleanor's written account with the methodical attention of a man who would stake his professional reputation on the accuracy of a document and intended to deserve that stake. He asked questions about soil composition and frost lines and the specific geography of the Bitterroot Creek Valley, and Eleanor answered them from knowledge that was partly inherited and partly built in the dark, with her hands bleeding into canvas sacks, and Kimball recorded everything and called it good. He also, before he left, told Eleanor that the land office in Washington had expressed interest in the documentation and that there was a possibility it would be reproduced beyond Montana territory. He said this as information rather than as excitement, because he was a man who had learned the distance between interest and action in government offices. Eleanor received it the same way and thought no more about it until the printed pamphlet arrived the following spring with her name on the cover page and the information inside exactly as she had written. It distributed across the territory to homesteaders who would read it or not read it, depending on whether the winter that found them was bad enough to make them pay attention. Samuel asked her to marry him on an evening in late April when they were sitting on the step outside her cabin, watching the light change over the western mountains in the particular orange-pink way it changed in spring, when the snow was still on the peaks and the lower slopes were bare, and the contrast made the whole sky look like it had been lit from within. He had been quiet for most of the evening, and Eleanor had been comfortable with the quiet, because she was comfortable with him in a way she had not been comfortable with anyone since Daniel, which was a different comfort than what she'd had with Daniel, but not a lesser one. Ellie. He used the shortened name the way he always did when he was speaking to her rather than at her. I've been building things for other people for a long time. I think I'd like to try building something for myself. A pause. I'd like for that to be a life with you and your children in it, if you're willing. He said it looking at the mountain rather than at her, which was honest rather than cowardly. He was a man who said things better when he didn't have to watch how they landed. Eleanor sat with it for a moment. She thought about Daniel not with the grief she had carried for a year, but with the steadier feeling of a person who has reorganized their relationship with a loss without dismissing it, who has found that the past can be held without being lived in. She thought about what she knew of Samuel, the way he worked, the way he listened, the way he had built a second ventilation valve into the system because he was thinking about contingencies she had not named yet, the way he had written a letter to Helena without telling her because he was not the kind of person who announced the things he was doing before he knew they would work. Yes, she told him, and then because this was who she was, but Henry is the best man. That's not negotiable. Henry, who had just turned 6 and had been given his first small hammer by Samuel 3 weeks prior, and had immediately used it to build something unidentifiable in the corner of the woodshed, accepted the role with the gravity it deserved and wore the same expression at the May ceremony that he wore when he was trying to drive a nail straight, which was to say he wore it with his whole face. The wedding was at the church which held the entire settlement without difficulty because it was May and the doors could be left open to the warm air coming down from the mountains. Ruth cried from the first hymn through the last prayer and was not embarrassed about this. Margaret Carlson sat in the third row with her husband, whose right hand now worked a hammer with 3 fingers and a thumb, and who had spent the winter teaching himself to do with 4 what he had previously done with 7, and she did not cry, but she was not absent either, which Eleanor counted as something. Vance walked Eleanor down the aisle because Alcott had suggested it, and she had agreed, and the irony was available to everyone in the room, and no one said anything about it because it was the kind of irony that was more true than funny. Vance himself wore the expression of a man who had accepted a role he understood he had not earned, but was doing his best to grow into. The summer of 1888 was the quietest and most ordinary summer Eleanor could remember in some years, which she understood was not accidental, but was the direct result of having survived something and having arrived on the other side of it in a condition that permitted ordinary things to happen. She tended the garden. She answered questions from families in the settlement who were beginning their own underground spaces. She completed the additional pages of documentation Kimball had requested in the spring. She slept through the night most nights, which was not something she had done reliably since April of the previous year. In September, she and Samuel traveled with Kimball to 3 other settlements in the territory, one 2 days' ride east, one north along the valley, one in the foothills above the Clark Fork River, and spent a week at each one consulting with families who had read the pamphlet or heard about Bitterroot Creek and wanted to see the method demonstrated by the people who had developed it. Eleanor dug the pilot holes herself at each location because she had learned that people trusted the knowledge more when they could see it applied by the person claiming to hold it. She had calluses now that were permanent. She had a back that ached in cold weather and did not apologize about it. She had the particular confidence of someone whose understanding of a thing has been tested at the level that removes all doubt. At the third settlement on the ride home through the foothills in October, with the aspens turned gold and the sky the cold, clear blue of high-altitude autumn, Samuel said what he had been thinking without preface. "You know what your father gave you?" It was not a question. Eleanor looked at the trees and the sky on the road ahead. "He gave me the principle. I did the digging." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "Most people are given the principle and wait for someone else to do the digging." Eleanor thought about this and found it true, and found that it was a strange thing to have your life reduced to accurately in a sentence, not diminishing but clarifying the way the best true things clarify. She didn't answer because it didn't need an answer. The winter of 1888 brought 3 significant storms and killed no one in Bitterroot Creek. The winter of 1889 brought 2 storms and a cold snap in February that produced the lowest temperatures anyone in the settlement had recorded and killed no one. By the third winter after the Great Blizzard, the underground rooms had become a feature of the settlement's domestic architecture, the way that cellars and covered wells were features of settlements in other parts of the country. Present functional expected discussed in terms of maintenance rather than revelation. On Christmas Day, 1889, Reverend Alcott held a service he had been planning since the previous summer, which was a formal acknowledgement of 2 years since the blizzard and of what the settlement had done with what it had learned from it. He was not a man given to ceremony for its own sake, and the service was plain. But at one point he asked Eleanor to stand, and he looked at her from the pulpit with an expression that was different from the expression he had worn on Thanksgiving of 1887, when he had studied her with the assessing gaze of a man who was reserving judgment. What he wore now was something less complicated, straightforward recognition of a fact that had been demonstrated past the point of requiring interpretation. Some of us doubted her. I include myself in that number without reservation. She saw a problem everyone else was accepting as a condition of life, and she found the answer in the place we had all been walking over without looking down. She trusted what she knew when none of us were ready to trust it with her. He paused. That is not a small thing. Clara at 10 stood straighter beside her mother when Alcott said this with the proprietary pride of a child who had always known something about her mother that it had taken everyone else a while to learn. Henry, now 7, looked around the church with the frank curiosity of a boy cataloging how many people were paying attention to his mother and found the number satisfactory. Margaret Carlson gave Eleanor a quilt that Christmas, a piece she had been working since October. Stitched with a pattern that suggested in its alternating rows of gray and tan and the way the shapes nested against each other, the cross-section of a stone wall seen from above. She did not attach a note to it. She handed it to Eleanor outside the church and said, "I was angrier at circumstances than I was at you. I wasn't entirely wrong to be angry, but I wasn't entirely right about who to aim it at. Eleanor took the quilt and held it and said what was true. You were grieving. I understood it. Margaret looked at her with the steady, unsentimental gaze of a woman who had spent a year revising her understanding of someone and was prepared to live with the revision. Even so, the documentation Kimball had published continued its distribution into the following years, carried by land agents to new settlements, included in the packets distributed to homesteaders making claims across the territory. A version of it was reprinted in an agricultural journal in 1891. Eleanor received a copy and read it with the particular detachment of a person reading their own thinking, translated into a form that is accurate but belongs to a different context, like hearing your voice played back to you by an instrument you didn't know was recording. Her name was on it. Her father's principle was in it, compressed into paragraphs that carried the shape of what she had understood without quite containing the substance of how she had come to understand it, which was with her hands in the dark, in the calm, in the months when she had been most afraid and had refused to let the fear choose for her. Henry's cough was gone by spring of 1888 and did not return. He grew through his 6th and 7th and 8th years with the unimpeded vitality of a child whose lungs had been given back the conditions they needed, and by the time he was 12, he was following Samuel around the workshop and asking the kind of questions that revealed that carpentry was going to be a language he spoke naturally rather than one he had to learn. By 17, he had his own set of tools. By 20, he was building structures in the territory that incorporated underground rooms, not as emergency measures, but as standard features designed from the foundation up, with the geothermal principle integrated into the architecture. When clients asked him where he had learned the approach, he answered without hesitation. My mother taught me, and the earth taught the rest. Clara moved to Idaho in 1899 with her husband, a surveyor named James, who had read the Marsh-Holt documentation in a land office pamphlet and had thought when he later met the daughter of the woman who wrote it that there was a kind of symmetry in this that deserved attention. Before she and James built their house outside of Boise, she wrote to Eleanor asking for advice about soil conditions and depth requirements in that part of Idaho, and the letter she received back was 4 pages in Eleanor's still upright handwriting, precise and specific and practical, containing everything she needed to know and nothing she did not need. Eleanor and Samuel traveled to Idaho the summer James and Clara were digging the foundation, and Eleanor spent 3 days on her knees in someone else's earth-testing walls and angles, and the temperature of the soil at depth with her bare hands, and on the 3rd day she pressed her palm flat against the wall of the completed excavation and felt what she felt and nodded once. 50 degrees, give or take. Eleanor died in the spring of 1923 at the age of 71 in the house she and Samuel had rebuilt and expanded 3 times over 35 years, with Clara's family come from Idaho and Henry, and his wife and their 4 children come from the eastern part of the territory, and with Ruth Calloway sitting in the chair beside the bed as she had sat in chairs beside Eleanor through most of the significant occasions of the preceding 4 decades, talking in the undemanding way of people who do not need their conversation to be profound. Samuel had been beside her through the night and was beside her when she went, holding her hand in both of his, the way a carpenter holds something he built and trusts and is proud of but knows he did not create alone. He survived her by 4 years and spent considerable portions of those years adding to the underground room, which had expanded twice since 1887, and was by now a proper sub-level, stone-walled and ventilated and insulated with the accumulated improvements of 3 decades of refinement. He added a shelf to the north wall in the summer after Eleanor died, and on it he placed the thermometer she had hung on the nail in December of 1887, the one she had read by candlelight in a room that should not have existed and that the earth had kept at 52 degrees regardless. He left it there, and the temperature did not change. They are buried side by side in the Bitterroot Creek Cemetery in a plot on the south-facing slope that gets sun even in January. The headstone is granite, which Henry selected and carved himself because it was the kind of work that deserved to be done by the right hands for the right reasons. Beneath their names, one line: she taught us to look down to rise up. The cabin still stands. The room beneath it is accessible by the original ladder, its rungs replaced twice but its configuration unchanged since Samuel built it in the winter of 1887. Visitors who climb down find stone walls packed with bark and moss exactly as Eleanor packed them, a wooden platform against the far wall, a ventilation pipe angling upward at the precise degree Samuel calculated for 3 occupants. On a nail in the upper course of the east wall, a brass thermometer. It reads 52 degrees, summer or winter. It reads 52 degrees. The earth held it then. The earth holds it now. The earth does not negotiate with seasons or with grief or with the arithmetic of a woman who had $7.30 and $152 of debt and 2 children whose breathing she monitored every night in the dark. The earth simply held the temperature it had always held and waited for someone to go deep enough to find it.